Harry, we've kept this till last, and we want to keep it fairly sort of vague, I suppose, for reasons of your job and everything. But problem gambling, massive in the context of affordability checks and all the rest. Everything that's going on at the moment. I know you want to talk about this a bit, but just to kick things off, you say there've been some cases where bookmakers have behaved very badly when a vulnerable person with a genuine problem has been concerned. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to be careful about that. I can't really talk about anything I've been directly involved in, but we all know it from the newspapers that there are the exception, I think. But there are, of course, instances where they've treated problem gamblers very badly, and the victims of problem gamblers, so people who've had money stolen from them by family members and that sort of thing. There's not much in the way of sympathy for those people. But I think it all does stem from a case that a lot of people will have heard of called Calvert and William Hill. And you may remember the greyhound trainer Graham Calvert Jr. And this was a case where he bet in vast quantities, absolute vast quantities, largely on greyhound racing, and he was restricted from greyhound racing, so he moved on to other things. He had I think the judgment records a £260,000 bet on the USA in the Ryder Cup, which lost. And why that was interesting was that he had tried to this was in the very early days of the Gambling Act. He tried to self-exclude using the William Hill internal procedures. And as a result of administrative errors, genuine administrative errors, he had not been excluded. He was able to continue to bet. And he continued to lose vast sums of money, and eventually he just said, right, this is your fault that I've lost all this money because I did ask to stop. I told you I was out of control. And he went to the High Court. And he said that this was the first time that the courts had to look at whether bookmakers owed a duty of care to potential problem gamblers. And they said that they did, but only in a very narrow sense, which was that once a punter has said, I've got a problem, I want to be excluded, there is a duty of care to take reasonable steps to honour that request. The court said there wasn't a general duty of care to identify and just say, look, if you're identify problem gamblers and not take their money. They said that was too close to asking them to become psychologists, basically. And so there was a duty of care, and William Hill was in breach of that duty of care in that case. So far, so good for Mr. Calvert. But the court went on to find that William Hill didn't have to pay him anything back because he was such a pathological gambler that he would have lost that money somewhere else. So in other words, causation hadn't been established, that the negligence hadn't caused the loss. Now, anyone who has tried, and I don't do many problem gambling cases, to be honest with you, but I've done a couple, and I'm sure that anyone who's tried legalistically to do it has been met with a letter from the in-house lawyers or the external lawyers of the bookmaker saying, no, Calvert and William Hill, your client would have lost this money somewhere else anyway. And I think that judgment was approved by the Court of Appeal, so it's quite powerful law. But I think it might be decided differently today because of the implications of that, which is, in many ways, the more problematic the gambler is, the more of an inducement there is for the bookmaker to take their bets, because it's easy to argue that a really bad gambler would have lost that money somewhere else anyway. And so, in my view, I think it might have contributed to a sort of race to the bottom, really, and of bookmakers really looking for people who, I don't think they would have admitted to themselves very often that these people have got problems. I just think they probably turned a blind eye to some strange behaviour. And I think that, frankly, all the stuff about VIP accounts and taking people to the FA Cup final and, Europa League final and things like that, that all sort of fell under that, really. I always thought that was a strange approach to business development. I also thought it was quite strange that people did it, because you don't get asked to the Champions League final because you're a brilliant punter by a bookmaker. It's because you've been identified as something of a mug, basically, and quite a big mug if you're being taken to the Champions League final. So I think a lot of that does come back down to that judgment in Calvert and William Hill. And the problem was that I think that regulation was supposed to step in there and deal with what the courts wouldn't deal with, and had mixed results.
I want to chip in here.
Yeah.
Something that you've said
Right.
that I want to pick up on that you don't know I'm going to say.
Okay.
Now, when you've said that the courts have agreed that that person would have, they're such a compulsive gambler, they would have lost their money somewhere else. We've all seen cases where somebody's stolen from their firm, and they're using that as a defence because they gambled it. Now, would that not be the same that if they're a thief, they would have spent the money on something else had they not gambled it?
Yeah, well, that was an argument that was raised, which is that this is very complicated. The Graham Calvert case. There are all sorts of things that come out of it, including that there was a failure by Calvert to plead something called loss of opportunity, which is, well, I might not have kept the money, but you should put a value on the opportunity I had to have kept the money. So I might have only been a 10% opportunity, in which case I should have had 10% of my winnings. There was another point, which is, well, he could have, instead of losing £100,000, he could have spent £100,000 on a meal. Is that, can that be treated the same as, oh, well, he would have lost it anyway? It is a strange judgment for the reasons that you identify, and it's not nearly as clear cut as bookmakers in particular would like it to be, because the judge makes it clear that there is behaviour that would be so extreme that bookmakers just simply shouldn't touch the bets. And also the other point is that a lot of bookmakers, a lot of problem gamblers aren't so bad that they will just gamble away everything. I mean, they actually made an explicit finding in that case that Calvert would have faced, I think it's social and financial ruin is the way they put it, because he was just so addicted. But imagine a scenario, for example, where someone might not have bet but for the inducements of bookmakers, come to Wimbledon, have a bet, that kind of thing. I think that would be probably rather different. But it's certainly the case that Calvert remains a problem for problem gamblers.
Okay, now I want to draw you into the Gambling Commission. You've got a few opinions about it.
Well, I mean, it's a young regulatory body, but it's not, in my view, not helped itself in its general approach. It's been distant. I think that it's not proactive. It's very reactive. It didn't see a lot of the problems coming, which were pretty obvious down the road. It's very defensive. I remember trying to get off them once just an old copy of the LCCP because I wanted to bring a claim under the basis of one that was 2 years old.
What's that?
So that's the licence conditions and codes of practice, which govern what bookmakers must do in order to maintain their licence. And the Gambling Commission's response was, please make a subject access request under the Data Protection Act in order to get basically just their old rules. Totally inappropriate thing for a subject access request, but it just gives you an idea of how defensive they were. I think anyone who's dealt with the Gambling Commission has come across sort of two responses. One is, oh, we're really interested in this, and if you ever get to court, do let us know how it goes, which is quite an extraordinary response. And the other one is sort of, who told you we're the Gambling Commission? Who gave you this number? Those seem to be the two extremes. Now, I've not dealt with them in a couple of years, and perhaps things have changed dramatically, so I have to caveat that. But I think that one of the problems with the whole idea of modernising the industry, increasing regulation is, well, we've built quite a lot of regulation into gambling already, and it's not worked very well. So is the answer really, a gambling ombudsman, for example? You're just increasing the number of people working in regulation, but until you get the regulation right, I'm not sure that's necessarily the answer.
And affordability checks aren't the answer either.
Well, affordability checks just increase the regulatory role of bookmakers in an industry where they have an interest in not releasing money to their customers. When you give money to a solicitor to buy a house, give them £200,000, their aim is to get you through the money laundering checks and get you your house, get their fees, everyone's happy. You give it to an accountant, it's to do your accounts. If you give it to me, it's to litigate. If you give £200,000 to a bookmaker, their aim is to keep it. And so giving them the regulatory obligation to then decide whether you're entitled to it to an extent is a little bit like marking your own homework. And I'm not sure really that element of self-regulation works terribly well in gambling. And I think the idea of now increasing that to the extent where, you know, they're going to be looking through people's, well, we don't really know what it's going to be, but there's a suggestion that they'll be looking through people's savings accounts, their income. You know, oh, you went to the cinema too many times last week, you can't have a bet, that kind of thing. I just think that increasing the role of bookmakers in regulation when they haven't done a brilliant job of it so far doesn't strike me as the answer. And that's before you get into what an extraordinarily radical proposal it is to look at people's bank statements before deciding whether they can buy a product. You know, they don't do it in alcohol, they don't do it in tobacco. And the other thing is, they're not actually talking about people with gambling problems here. They're just talking about affordability. So they slightly fudge that, I think, the proponents of this, which is that they say, well, affordability is linked to harmful gambling. Well, but they're not the same thing, you know. And so I don't think affordability checks are the answer, but we'll see.
Now, coming to the end of this now, do you choose not to defend these bookmakers, or is it just on your remit?
I work for bookmakers. I don't work for them in these cases. I've never been instructed in one, but you know, I was talking to you earlier about, we've been at Gardner Leader, we've been setting up a new online bookmaker in recent weeks. It's just launched for Cheltenham. So I don't, and I work closely with lots of people who own interests in bookmakers and people who work for bookmakers. And I'm not a bookie basher by any stretch of the imagination. But when it comes to litigation, I tend to be instructed by the punter.
Okay, now, is it, I'm just going to chuck this out at you, people watching the crime series on the telly will often wonder how these duty solicitor can defend these scumbags that have done a heinous crime. I mean, you know...
Yeah, I don't do that, Simon, I promise.
No, but if just for hypothetically, if you were given a bookmaker where you think, hang on a minute, you should be paying this fella, would you...
No, because it's not your job, you know. Your job is to advise and represent. So if a bookmaker came to me, if I thought they would lose in court, I would say, I think you should pay out, or pay out some of it. And if I didn't, then I'd advise them, and then they make the decision about how they want to do it. I mean, obviously everyone has a line that they won't cross in terms of, you know, and there are professional obligations as well about not misleading. But as long as you're in line with your professional obligations, then I'd have no issue in acting for bookmakers either, because, you know, they're two sides of the same coin. Without, you know, the way to look at it is an industry rather than as... I don't tend to look at it as bookmakers on one side and gamblers on the other. But it is true to say, I mean, you know, as I say, I've advised quite a lot of bookmakers, not in... I haven't got to court with it, but I help bookmakers with things and have no objection to doing so. Okay,
the final question then. In your experience so far, personally, who have been the most honourable, the punters or the bookmakers?
Well, it's a war, isn't it? I think all's fair in love and war to an extent. But I think actually, I think I'll give you some politician's answer to this. I think that really the story of regulated bookmaking since the Gambling Act has actually probably been a failure of regulation more than anything. I think if it was properly regulated, we wouldn't be worrying about who was more honourable, because it would work better. And I know bookmakers get very frustrated by the regulation as well. It's not just the punters. And it is a young regulator. I think one of the things that was an issue early on were who it was employing from day one, whether they had the nous, or whether they were just the type of people that sort of cruise from one of these type of bodies to another. And I think that's something that needs to be really looked into when it, you know, if there is going to be this big bang where it's reset, is making sure that there are people who really understand the nitty-gritty of the way the industry works and aren't endlessly watching and trying to learn after the event, which is the impression I've always had with the Gambling Commission.
Okay, this is the definite final question.
Okay.
We try and keep these with a long shelf life, so we're recording it in 2023. Right. In 2033, has this all sorted itself out?
In 2033, something's changed. Something dramatic will have changed in the next 10 years, because I don't see how it carries on like it does. But of course, we've got this white paper, which might be the beginning of that. I think that at some point, someone will do a proper review into gambling, and I think at that point, an awful lot of things will come out of the cupboard and be swept up. But I suspect we're looking at a very different regulatory climate in 10 years' time. Whether that's a good thing or not, it's probably a question for the government and the Gambling Commission, really.
Okay, so anybody watching this in 2033, hopefully they're giving you the thumbs up, Harry.
Yeah.
And well, anyway, thank
hopefully
you.
they don't instruct me. Yeah.
And thank you very much for doing this
Not
interview.
at all.
Harry
Thanks very
Stewart-Moore,
much,
thank you
Simon.
very much.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Cheers.